Usually I earn it. Okay, can you believe it? I'm standing on top of a T-34 85. I'm standing on top of an icon. I mean, this is truly amazing. And before I run off and start talking about some stuff, I think it's amazing because we have a number of, every day we have special guests and with the mayor and councilors and everything, but today we've got Kirill Mikhailov. He's a consul general from the Consulate General of the Russian Federation. So, it's an honor to have you here, sir, because this to us is just so amazing. I've been looking for one of these for a while. I mean, this just doesn't, the paint job, we can fix that. We just got it yesterday. So we cleaned it off. It runs. It runs. There's 3 in Canada, including this. This is the only one that runs. And because you all know this, we bring history to life, and we are a living history museum. We have shows. This will be out in the shows. I know we have a lot of Russian reenactors here that are, well, they're very excited to say the least. But they're speaking Russian, so I don't really know how excited they are, but they seem to be excited. But anyways, and I understand we do have a lot of Russian guests today, of Russian descent, or the Russian community. When I talk about a lot of stuff, if you have any questions, there's plenty of other Russians that could interpret for you if need be. But again, I come back to this icon. There's a lot of myths about it. There's a lot of amazing stories about it. There's a lot of heroic stories. There's sadness associated with it because of the conflict. The conflict over here in the west, on our hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, even like in Great Britain and France, they don't really, I think, appreciate and understand the immense size of the conflict. What went on in the Eastern Front after the Germans invaded Russia? What went down? At the end of the day, it's shocking when you look at the numbers. The numbers tend to move around a bit, but the Soviet casualties were in the neighborhood 20 to 27 million. Put that into perspective. Look at the population of Canada. It's crazy. The initial, after the Germans invaded, Operation Barbarossa, when they invaded, I mean, I'll talk more about that and the tank structure, but when they invaded, there was the tactics and the shock and the poor state of the Soviet military machine. Millions of people were captured. Millions of people were killed. It's just unbelievable. This thing here was in the beginning. This to people in Canada, the US, England, and even France. This is the Russian Sherman tank. And I want to talk comparisons about that. We've got one right, we got 2 of them right there. And now we have this icon. There's a lot of Sherman tanks around. There's not a lot of T-34 85s around. Let's go back to the beginning. How did they end up with the T-34 85? Well, I guess when Stalin and you know, there's got to be flexible with some of the dates I give here. When Stalin came into power, and around 28, 29, 1928, 29, 30, they wanted to modernize. They wanted to industrialize. They were far behind England, especially America, you know, with Henry Ford and the whole mass production of things and everything. The Russians, under Stalin, they wanted it to be an effective, modern, high-tech for the time, military machine. But they didn't have the industrial base to build them. So what you had the Russian, or should say Soviet government, looking abroad. And they brought in a guy, one guy in particular, there was probably several. His name was Alfred Kahn, and he came and he was an expert in putting together huge factories. And if any of you have heard of the Stalingrad locomotive or tractor factory, I forget the exact name, it was Alfred Kahn, an American that came over, was hired by the Soviet government to industrialize and help that go. And he set up dozens and dozens, and then that expanded, and then once the trick and the techniques were learned, then they multiplied it themselves. But think about it. You go from an agrarian type of country to some, all of a sudden industrial. It happened literally kind of overnight. It evolved in Canada and in the US and in England over 100 years. But they went it's just amazing when you think about how fast the transformation was made. So they started thinking, well, we wanted an armored force. Well, where did they go? In England, the Vickers company had a Vickers export tank that they were selling to other people. And the agents from the Soviet Union, like representing them, went to the US, and there was a guy called Walter Christie, and he had a very unique tank system, an armored system, and it had the Christie suspension, which is this suspension that you're looking at right here. And that's noted. Any tank enthusiast knows of the Christie suspension. Well, the only one that took Walter Christie serious was the Soviets, and they've adopted it, and they put it into their BT series. There was a T-26, which was served for for infantry support, and then there was a BT series that was kind of like the Russian cavalry. It would go and expand and go, and that was the idea behind it. Well, that was in the early 30s, after the industrialization, and they started to get the BT series and this T-26, and then they started using them. And there was a number of conflicts, some of which were in Spain, with the Spanish Civil War. Some were actually, you don't hear about it hardly at all, and that was around in Manchuria. And the Soviets were fighting the Japanese and some other individuals over there. And they were using these tanks they had, this T-26 and the VT series. There's a whole series of them. Anyways, they found the flaws. They had a small gun and they had thin armor. It wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to work at all, because they found the anti-tank guns at the time were punching right through them. And they had the war with Finland in 1939. That didn't go over too well, because they had a lot of vehicles were captured then. That's when they started to use this new thing called T-34. 1937, there was a guy, Mikhail Koshkin, and he was assigned to come up with a replacement for the BT series. So he liked the suspension. You know, it's interesting, because the BT series and even the T-26 series, they didn't trust the tracks. Metallurgy wasn't the strongest skill set in the Soviet Union. So what they did is they actually drove around without the track, and they had power to the wheels, to the road wheels, anywhere from 4 to 6 of the road wheels. All that did was add complexity to an already, for the time, inferior tank, because the armor was too thin and the gun was too small. So what they did, by then they started getting better, and they said, well, forget about the driving on the roads, because there weren't a lot of roads back then. It was mainly cross country. So they got rid of they put the tracks back on, kept them on, and they got rid of the drives from the road wheels, and they put it on the front sprockets, or I should say, this is the T-34, the rear sprockets. The engine's in the rear, and the power is driven from the rear. A lot of other tanks, the power, like the Sherman tanks, it's front wheel drive or front sprocket drive. But coming back to that, this guy came up with a design called the A-20. And the A-20 was very unique. It had this shape, not this turret, but it had this shape, sloped armor. Now, sloped armor wasn't new, but it was never really used to the extent of this. Germans were aware of it, they just didn't think it was that important, I guess. But the Russians did, and they used this. They had the sloped armor. The turret was a lot smaller. Remember, this is an 85. The turret on the 86, you can see the slope up there. Well, the turret, it was much tiny, and the actual slope followed right up from the side, up the side of the turret. So the turret was very small. Again, we'll come back to that in a minute. But here's this T-34, the very first one that came out, and this guy, Koshkin, and he had to prove himself. He had to prove it. So he went from Kharkov, which is the mother, whatever you call it, the homeland where it was initiated, into Ukraine. It was in the, again, one of the factories, tractor or locomotive, I think that was a tractor factory there. And it's interesting, that's from Kharkov, where it all began, where this guy started. He drove 2,000 kilometers in this tank to prove that it would work. And he drove and he went around, and Stalin saw it, and he hit all the different places, and they looked at it and they thought, this is really good. He had some problems and he shook it out as it was moving, and then he drove it all the way back. And shortly after that, they adopted his design. By the way, my wife right there and her mother are both from Kharkov. So I mean, that's kind of cool. No, I'm not attracted to her because she's from Kharkov in the tent. But I'll tell you, it didn't hurt. Anyways, he drives there, and the unfortunate thing, the guy dies. On that trip, he gets pneumonia, and he passes away. Well, interestingly enough, this guy over there, he's quite the hero. He is the father of the T-34, as we know it. And they actually have, and Sergei was kind enough to let me actually show this. There's one of the medals. This is a commemoration of his 100th birthday, had he been alive. And I guess, Sergei, you were saying that this is handed out to people who are innovative scientifically and that kind of thing. So, quite a guy. Unfortunately, he never lived to see where it went. The designer of the engine in this, it's a 500 horsepower, I believe it's 12-cylinder, and it has an aluminum block, which is kind of odd in a way, because aluminum's not the easiest thing to get, especially during wartime. But it's aluminum block, and it's quite a specific engine that was utilized long after this particular model was around. The guy that created that, he was arrested and subsequently shot during Stalin's purge of the military. And then then you had the founder of the T-34, he ends up dying, I told you, of pneumonia, so who's left? Well, the guy that developed the gearbox, the transmission, he takes over control of everything, and they start producing them. Okay, so that's how we got to here. So I would have loved to have seen the look in the first German that came across this, because it was a shocker. You had thicker armor than anything the Germans had. You had thicker armor. You had bigger gun. Not this gun, this is really big. It was a 76 millimeter gun. High velocity, biggest on a tank for its time. It was amazing. One of the unfortunate things about it was that it wasn't properly utilized. The troops were not properly trained, and the tactics just were not there. A troop leader would have a radio, but the other tanks wouldn't. So every 6th or 8th, depending on the size of your troop, would have a radio. So what tended to happen, and what was observed, I guess you could say by the Germans first going in, was that you'd have the lead tank going and the rest of them would be following. Up here, this is called a commander's cupola or cupola, and this kind of swings around, and there's periscopes all the way around here, and there's another one here that spins. So the commander could look in all directions. In the very first T-34, there was just one little periscope like that facing forward. So he couldn't see what was around him. He had no field of vision. It's difficult to acquire targets, difficult to manage the rest of the troop. You got one guy looking out there. And on top of that, it was only a 2-man turret. Only a 2-man turret. So other than being the commander, he was also the loader. He loaded the gun. He should be managing, he should be controlling everything, but he couldn't, because he also had to do that. So it was underutilized. ineffective. Some people say it was a design. But it gets better. Because people learn from their mistakes. I'm going to compare this to the Sherman very briefly, because we're talking about this. But I just want to compare it because this is what the Western world knows the Sherman. Sherman started off in the same situation. It started off with certain characteristics, and the gun ended up, the gun was really big for its time when this first came out, with 76 millimeter. Germans had never seen anything like that. But pretty soon the Germans outgunned, and then it became small. And then what do you do then? Well, you got to make it. You got to decide what you want to do, and that is basically keep losing all your tanks. I'll just give you an idea. There was approximately 85,000 T-34s made. Germans took out 45,000. 45,000. The first year of the war, when the Germans invaded, they took out over 25,000 tanks. 3,000 T-34s, and the rest of them were all the other tanks, the BTs and the T-26s that I spoke about before. This was on such a large scale that the more I look into it, the more I do research on the whole event. I've always been fascinated. I remember when before I got into tanks, I used to collect guns and weapons. I used to think I was the guy that had the best Eastern Front weapons. We're talking not tanks, we're talking like machine guns and mortars and things like that. And I used to collect the Russian and the German stuff because I've always been fascinated because it was on such an immense scale. Not to put down what we saw on D-Day and fighting up to Italy and across Sicily into Italy. Not to diminish that at all, but the scale of this is almost difficult to believe. You look at the front of this particular vehicle. I just want to show you. You see the track on the front that's been put on, that black? That was not. We got this tank yesterday. It came in, we took it off. Had fun starting it, but it started because it's cold and this is old. And each one of those, what have we got? There's 5 pieces of track there. I got those on eBay. eBay, the tank T-34 track. How do you get it on eBay? Well, one was from Latvia, 2 were from Russia, 1 was from the Ukraine, and I think 1 was from Poland. They all come in, because it took me 5 months to get this over here, so I had a little bit of time to get some stuff. And by the way, you see that that's a sight. That's a tank gunner's sight. Got it on eBay. T-34, 85 millimeter. And that sight is right below my left foot, right there. Well, that's an extra one. So when we're done talking, feel free to come up. It's set up right there, and it's pointing at that German Hetzer right there. And that's what it would have pointed at during World War II. So when we're done, come back up. You want to see what a T-34 gunner would look at is the sights. Speaking of the sights, T-34 85 sights. This is an 85 millimeter. Challenge to the Tiger, challenge to the 88 millimeter. That sight was a vast improvement. The very first one. The German optics were amazing. Zeiss, I think it's the pronunciation.
Zeiss.
They make binoculars and optics now for cameras and everything. Back then, they made all the tank optics for gunnery, and they were incredible. I read reports on Russians getting them off a captured machine. These are amazing, and they were. But the Soviets, being quick studies, quick learners, those are equal to anything Zeiss ever put out. You have a look at that. That is on the T-34/85, what I'm standing on. So how did we end up with this? This is an 85. T-34 was, fantastic. They had the numbers. They say half of the lost tanks were because of malfunctions, breakdowns. At the start of the war, there was 900 T-34s, first version with 76 millimeters. 900 when the Germans moved in. When they went to go to battle, when they went to engage the enemy, more than half of them broke down. More than half. It's hard to believe. And then we talk about the British chieftain. So we had some issues too, a lot of tanks. The Battle of Kursk. Who's heard about the Battle of Kursk? Okay, a lot of hands have heard that. That's the battle. I mean, this was called the Great Patriotic War. You think about it. These aggressive people invading your country, a political doctrine that is totally different than your own, looking at they just rolled through France, they just rolled through Belgium and all the Netherlands and everything. Look what they did at Dunkirk. They bombed the hell out of the UK, and now they couldn't defeat them in the Battle of Britain, so they end up turning their backs. Instead of invading England, they invaded Russia, the Soviet Union. You're probably all aware, before Hitler moved into Poland, he cut a deal with Molotov, cut a deal with Stalin for a treaty. So they came to terms, okay, non-aggression pact. So then they carved up the spoils. Germans come in, took 2/3, and the Russians snuck in the back way and they got a third of Poland. That bought both sides time. Because I don't think Stalin saw it coming. It was inevitable. One of the two was going to hit. You got to remember first, the Germans, when they invaded, you don't usually attack unless you have a very high, numerically you're superior, 2, 3 to 1. Germans weren't. They were aggressive. The tanks, they didn't have a third of the tanks the Russians had. They didn't have anything like this T-34, but it's not what you have, it's how you use it. And it wasn't properly used. But man, oh man, now I'm going to jump way ahead and I'm going to come back. Way ahead, at the end of World War II, there was such a military juggernaut. A military, and they took Blitzkrieg to a whole new level. When they came into Germany and with their artillery, with their armored, and this is what we're talking, 95% of all the tanks was what you're looking at right here by the end of the war. They were a machine to be feared. Thank God they stopped and they didn't keep going. Or we would have had another war. And my dad probably would have been in it then because he was just a hair younger. Next year he would have been in the army. So now let's come back to Kursk. Kursk, the last big shot of the German before the slow degradation. And what they did, the Germans put everything they had. They had the new Panther tank. Panther tank with its high velocity, 75 millimeter, could easily take out any T-34. The Tiger, of course, could take out any T-34. And this Kursk there was other armor in there, but it was a T-34 76. What they had was unbelievable. If you've watched any documentaries on it, and there's so many different documentaries, but they all whistle the same tune. There was layers upon layers, and the Soviets, they knew they were coming. They knew the Germans were coming, and they even knew when they were coming and where. And the Germans still punched through, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers of defense. But the Russians had this one big thing in their back pocket. And I don't know what it was, 1,000 or 2,000 T-34s. Not the new one, the older one. But they knew that they couldn't go toe-to-toe with them. So they swarmed them. They put mass assault. I still watch this documentary and I just find it amazing. They're interviewing Russian tank commanders in Kursk, after, and they said, they knew we couldn't go. They told me to do something, and I said, that was so crazy. He said, what's that? Ram them. Ram them. You got the numbers. You can't win in a gunfight. So they rammed them. They went in, they smashed. All you got to do is pick a corner of a Panther, pick a corner of a Tiger, and you immobilize it, and they're gone. And then the other can swarm around and take it out with your cannons from behind, because that's the weak spot. So this is what they did. So the Germans found out, if they didn't know beforehand, they had to realize by then. They had no idea there was another 2,000-3,000 tanks coming at them. They just took out everything in front of them. They were down on their knees. They had no idea there was a fresh Boxer coming out to go another round with them. And that's what happened. And it ended up, still, even at the end of the day, the Germans were taking out 3 to 4 tanks for every one they lost. That carried on till, I think it was January or February of 1945. That was the tenacity. This is the Great Patriotic War. This was it. millions and millions of people killed. This was it. This is a country immobilizing not just an army, but its citizens. Like the Germans advancing. The Stalingrad factory making T-34s. Germans advancing on Stalingrad. You know how it ended, of course, Stalingrad. But before that, just before it ended favorably for the Soviets, the Soviets pulled out of that factory and reassembled it the other side of the Urals. They did that across the board. The Kharkov factory, that got moved back. This particular one was made in the Gorky factory, which is, there's a little more to that name, but I'll simplify it by saying Gorky. I can't remember the rest.
Maxim.
What is it?
Maxim Gorky. So the right Maxim Gorky.
Okay, Maximum. That's like Big Gorky. Okay. So it was, they moved that. I'm going to tell you about this particular machine, just from investigating. I have no papers, I have no history on it, but there are books. And there's a red book, it's called the Bible for T-34s. And you can imagine here, I was sitting down here, going over every inch, I was inside, I was looking. What you look tells you a story, and I'm going to tell you the story about this in a moment. So in Kursk, they realized two things. The Germans realized the Panzer III, that's that one right over there, and there was about 300 of those in Kursk. Where's Jeremy?
Right here.
Did you got your thing? You what?
No batteries.
Oh, okay, no problem. I was gonna laser it for you just so everyone. Anyways, that's a Panzer III over there, and they realized after Kursk, they pulled them out of service as a direct line. The Panther tank was to replace it. It was the main battle tank, believe it or not, for the Soviets. And the T-76, which come out, was started being built in 39-40, was basically, could take it down. It could pierce the armor with its cannon, and its cannon, even the best cannon they could put on it, which was a 50mm high velocity, still had to hit this, not this one, the older one, in the right spot. So it was out of the picture then. And then the Soviets also realized that the T-34, my God, we got to ram tanks. There's a high-tech feature, huh? Let's ram it. That can't. The Panther, and they had the Stug. The Stug was using a Panzer III chassis with a 75 high-velocity cannon on it, same as the Panther. They were taking them out left, right, and center. They were very effective in taking out Soviet tanks. Now, how do you upgrade it? Well, they looked at something called, this is a T-34, they called something a T-43. T-43 had 70% of the same components. Everything about this, and this is why it's such an iconic thing, was the mindset that went into building this in the factories and with the different levels of the Soviet government. In the factories where they made these, they were so needed for the line because it was a war of attrition. You would not make any change to this tank unless, one, it reduced the costs, and two, it increased production. If it doesn't do one of those two things, leave it alone. You keep cranking them out, you keep making them. Numbers, it was a numbers game. And that's what this was all about. So they come out with a T-43. That was a little heavier, and it had a turret very similar to this. At the end of the day, for a variety of reasons, they decided to stick with this chassis, the T-34 chassis. But this turret spins, right? And the turret spins on a ring. They had to increase the ring size, but was 5 or 6 inches bigger to put this turret on. This roughly was the turret that they designed for this other tank they were going to produce called the T-43. But it was heavier and subsequently slower, and it didn't mass produce as quick. So there's a number of features. So they said, forget that. The gun, where do we get this gun? Well, you heard about the German 88, the infamous German 88. The Tiger tank had an 88mm, and that was very effective. the Germans took that the anti-aircraft cannon and used it as an anti-tank. This was a Russian anti-aircraft cannon, which they modified to fit inside this particular turret. It wouldn't fit in the small turret of the 76 turret. It was a two-man turret. You couldn't get it to fit in. So you had a bigger turret. That's why this kind of looks, it looks kind of funny because the turret's almost too big for the chassis when you look at it. But that's what they did. They didn't care about the look. Look at the, I had one guy tell me, oh, it's got battle damage. You see the scuffing on that? That's where they cast it and they cut it away from the, you know when you got a model that comes in plastic model and you bend it, you break it off? You got that? Well, it's not plastic, it's metal. It's a metal casting. It's there, it's on the side here on this mantlet. This top cover down there, it looks like a kid made it with paper mache. That's the casting. It's rough casting. They didn't care if it looked good. Look at the side of this thing. It looks like it's made out of cement. It's not. That's cast iron. But it was made quick. It was made cheap. It was made to win a war, not look good. Germans should have thought of that. Their stuff looked too good, but it didn't get the numbers. It cost too much. So they put this 85 millimeter, not an 88, but an 85 millimeter on this turret that was supposed to go on the T-34. They put it on this T-34 chassis, well, because they already had it, and they were making them. They just changed the turret, made the turret ring 5 inches, 5, 6, whatever it was, inches wider, and put this on. So now you had something here that could take out a Tiger. Now you had something here that could take out a Panther tank at a distance. You listen to the interviews of the guys before they got these. They'd have to run and hide. How many of you saw the movie Fury? Now we're talking Sherman tank. Remember when they took on the Tiger tank? The Tigers going like this and they're going, oh, go faster, and they're trying to get around behind it because they know once that gets on, you're gone. Well, they said we didn't have to do that anymore. The only problem is you better hit them when you aim at them, because this armor is significantly more on the turret, but not on the chassis. Now, I'll share with you something. This, like the Sherman tank, from when it was first conceived till the end of the war, the production costs almost halved, the armor almost doubled, and the gun penetration almost doubled. This has got an 85 millimeter. That is a 76 millimeter high velocity. It basically has the same punch. You know, when you're talking 76 versus 85, it's the diameter of the bore. But if you look at 75 millimeter cannons that were on some of the initial ones, on the Stug and the Panzer IV, the whole shell and everything's only that long. You look at one that's, say, in the Sherman, or one that's in this, they're like that long. There's the round, the shell that goes out, then there's the brass casing in the back. That's got the propellant, that's what gives it the punch, that's what drives it through the other tank. So, at the end of the day, they produced so many of these things. They kept producing them after the end of the war, but much lower. Poland produced some, Czechoslovakia produced some, and this thing was I mentioned to some of you guys, Laos, the country Laos, if I'm not mistaken, it was 12 or 15 of these T-34-45s were still in the Laotian army, and they were shipped back to Russia. And I heard they were welcomed, and they were met as the trains went through, those crowds of people, because this is such an icon. Such an icon. They moved these back, these protected them, they kept it. They did the impossible. How on earth do you move an entire factory? Literally, like, I don't know how many miles. Was it 1,000, 1,500 miles or kilometers to behind the Ural Mountains in some remote area where people can't get at it? So that's the story of that. Let's talk about this particular one. This one here has a serial number that starts with 3. It's on the front plate. 3 tells you it's what year. And then the next number tells you the month. And then the next series of numbers tells you what number it was in that month. In other words, 3 says 1943, 9 tells you September, and if it says 321, then that was the 321st tank built in the factory at that time there. So the chassis was built. But I'm looking at it and I'm researching, okay, well something doesn't look right. The turret, this is called a mushroom turret. You see this round thing up here? They're ventilations, because when you fire a cannon and open it up, the cabin in the turret, it fills with smoke. So there's fans underneath there. They used to have them earlier in the war, they had the two of them joined in the back, they overlap. But now they have them separate, and because it kind of looks like a mushroom, they named this thing the mushroom turret. This mushroom turret was only produced in the factory 112, or Gorky. That's the same factory that was produced. The chassis, I say that, the chassis, the lower part. But that was 43. These were not made. I started making them in January of 1945. So, how come? Well, you start looking at it, and you start seeing some weld marks down here that follow. One problem that the Soviets had in manufacturing, and remember, they were new to it. You didn't have these huge, it didn't evolve in an industrial base over 100 years. 10 years. That's where they had the 5-year plans. They moved mountains, they accomplished so much. There was a price for that, but they still accomplished so much. Problem was metallurgy. Whether it was too much nickel in the metal or too little nickel, I forget how that worked. But what it meant was, sometimes when the Germans or anyone fired and hit you, it shattered, or it cracked. Or there's something called spalling. And that is that if, let's say, a Panther tank fired and hit this, and it ricocheted off, didn't go through the armor, you say, well, that's good. But the impact on the outside made on the inside of the steel shattered. And that just exploded, and if you got crew in there, your crew was hurt. So there was all kinds of problems with metallurgy. A lot of times welds, if you got hit, the weld would come apart. And this was an ongoing problem. It got better near the end of the war, but you remember, it was quantity, not quality. We want to save our country. We got to stop these people. We got to get these tanks out. Numbers, numbers, numbers. And it worked. But again, it worked at a price. So what we have here is, I firmly believe, by looking at the machine gun port, you can see it right there, that machine gun port has been cut off, re-welded on. This whole front plate, that's beneath the barrel where the hatch is, that's called the glacis plate. I believe that's been damaged in battle. This turret, the original turret, this isn't it, this turret has been damaged beyond repair. So one of the things you got to remember, you're producing that many tanks, you got to deliver them to the front. You deliver them to the front by rail. Because different factories had different nuances, it was difficult to send a damaged T-34 85 or any damaged T-34 to a plant where it wasn't made, because some of the parts may not fit. Remember, quantity, not quality. So this, I believe, this vehicle was damaged in battle. This is World War II dated. I believe that it was hit in the front, and I'll tell you why. Because the parts I mentioned a moment ago, that machine gun port and the other ones have been re-welded on. There's an extra 1 or 2 layers of weld that should not be there. And down here, that plate on the side, it's all shattered. And you can have a look at where, when you have a crack in metal, any of you done any welding, you have to grind down, and then you fill that groove, follow the crack, and you fill it with weld. That gives it the strength. They've done that all down there. There's probably 10 or 12 of them. There's nothing. I thought I saw one earlier. I went to look for it. I couldn't find it. So that being the case, if a shell struck it on this angle, the energy would transfer that way, and it would crack this. So that's just what I'm thinking. It was hit there, it came across and took it out there. But that's one issue. But the fact that this is a newer turret. So this probably was out there, saw service, got taken out, on a rail car that came and dropped off new tanks, they put on. Sometimes they make a repair in the field, sometimes they can't. I read they put them back on a rail car, back to the original factory, because that's where they're going, because another load's gonna come out, because they're cranking these things out. Then they take these off, they look at it, come up with a game plan, and then they put them in the queue, and they run it through the plant, and it comes out the other end. So that's one of the reasons why you see a lot of this. A friend of mine, a colleague of mine, Randy Baird in Colorado, he's got he's the only other guy I know who's got a T-34 85. It runs, it's in Colorado. I'm talking to him, I know he's working on something, he might need some money, so maybe we'll have two. That's another story. But anyways, he said to me, he's got the same thing. He's got battle damage on his, and he has the same mushroom top. And he's got clear battle damage. You go in the side and you feel the edge, you can feel big lumps on the edge where it's taking hits. So man, they just recycled them and they kept them going. So that's the story on this. I think this is amazing. I'll just tell you one last story. You think the war's over. 1945, May, you know, peace in Europe, German surrender. Well, what happens? Roughly 5 years later, 1950, June 1950, the North Koreans invade South Korea. What do they got? They got a lot of men, and they got 250 of these puppies right here. 250. Cruiser, Soviet trained, produced, this Soviet manufactured, and they came into South Korea. Interesting, because they now came up against the Shermans. These Shermans, they call them the Easy Eights. Before they did, when they first went in, the Americans had a token group of people, I think it was about 400, and they were on a hill and they had to withdraw and they lost about 2/3 of their men, not due to the tanks, but by just the swarming North Korean infantry. But the Americans, they threw anything they could in front of these tanks coming. Crazy, but they threw that one there, the chassis. Right there. John, wave your hand. Right behind John waving his hand, that's a chassis. A chaffee, what am I saying, chassis? This is a chassis. That's a chaffee, and that chaffee basically, it's got a 75 low velocity gun, and it made some fire, it fired at these things, just bounced off, did nothing. They even used, there's accounts where they used the American 3.5 rocket launcher, the bazooka, they called it, they fired at that, and again, they hit it, and it didn't have, remember, this armor's been up-armored more. At the end of the war, double the armor from what it had at the beginning. But so did the Sherman. The Sherman started off the same. Its armor doubled. Its piercing power, 76, high velocity, very similar to this. There are certain sides and angles and characteristics of that. It has thicker armor than this, and there's certain characteristics of this that's thicker armor than that. This turret, I believe, has thicker armor all around for the turret there. But here's the difference. Training and creature comfort. Those things are a lot more comfortable. There's a lot more room in them. Those things, I'm talking those things, the Sherman, the crews were trained much better. A lot of them were World War II vets that had been in them. And the statistics said that, how did this work? They had a 68% chance, because they were only firing maximum in Korea, because it's very hilly, was maybe 400 meters. So I mean, first hit, you're going to get it. The crew, North Korean crews manning this, they had about a 23% chance that they would hit on first shot. So 68% for the American crews in the Shermans. So it's very interesting because during the World War II, there were Sherman, Lend-Lease. We sent so many of them over. Those two Shermans right there, both of them are the latest Shermans, the last ones that were made. I think they were made in February or January of 45. They were supposed to be going over to Russia. They had all Russian letters inside them. They had 19 set radios, all with Russian lettering on it, Russian instructions. We ended up buying them, the Canadians. We bought about 300 of them. I think it was 46, 47 for $200 each. And that's what the Canadian Army had here, because it was cheaper to do that than bring anything back. So we left everything in Europe and we used those, but they were supposed to be going to the Soviet Union and the Lend-Lease. They never did. But it's ironic, and yet they were fighting alongside of these against the Germans on the Eastern Front. And then here we are 5 years later, they're fighting against this in Southeast Asia. Not the Russians, but the tanks. So, anyways, I just want to just wrap this up by saying this is so iconic. It's not without flaws. It's not without that. But this goes beyond just a piece of metal. This is an icon. This is symbolic of the quote Great Patriotic War, where a whole nation, which is on the they were on the verge of destruction and 27 million casualties. Like, people should know this more, and they don't. So this is a very welcome addition. This was the largest during wartime. This is, to this date, this is the highest production volume ever during wartime of any tank in any war. So it holds a lot of records, other than being an icon and very symbolic for, this great patriotic war of survival is what it was. This lent itself. What came next? What came next after this T-34 85? We got it right over there, the T-54. And the T-54 has a lot of the same parts as this, but the shape, as iconic as this was, as innovative and unique this was, that's equally innovative. And the highest production of all time, not for wartime tank, but production of all time tank, was this, until that. That T-54, T-55 has been exported everywhere. That was a mainstay of the Soviet economy. You had, they were selling it on, Middle East had them. They were everywhere. You see on television, you still see T-54s, T-55s around there. So it's amazing. Now we just need a T-62 and then a T-72, and then we'll have the whole set. We tend to collect sets. But anyways, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I'm welcoming our newest edition, because I think this is, I'm excited about a lot of things, but this has got to be right up there, I mean, it's ugly, but it's so beautiful. What can I say?
Alan.
Well, thank you, Mr.